Welcome everyone to the 2022 John Rieger Speaker Series. We are very excited to have Dr. Victor Ray with us this year. Before I introduce him, I'm going to inform everyone that you are being recorded. This presentation is being recorded, and ask everyone to please mute their microphones. Thank you. Dr. Victor Ray is an F. Wendell Miller Associate Professor of Sociology and Criminology at University of Iowa. His research applies critical race theory to sociological questions. He has looked at issues of racial inequalities in policing, in incarceration. He's also done a lot of work that looks at ideology and critical work of ideologies such as racial progress paradigm. His work has been published in a lot of our top journals in sociology and the social sciences, American Sociological Review, the American Behavioral Scientists, Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, Contexts, Ethnic and Racial Studies, and the list goes on. He's also a public scholar, publishing in outlets such as the Washington Post, Newsweek, and the Boston Review. He's currently working on 2 book manuscripts. Today, he's going to be discussing racialized organizational theory, applying it to many timely topics such as immigration, voting, and our safety net or lack thereof. If John Rieger were still with us, I know he would be delighted to have a scholar like Dr. Ray bringing us together to discuss these very important topics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Victor Ray.
Great. Thank you for the kind introduction, and I want to thank everyone in attendance, particularly my former student, Haley Metcalf, and the Rieger Committee for extending the invitation, and Nancy Price, is she still? No, for setting things up. So today I'm going to be talking about my collaborative work with Pam Hurd and Don Moynihan on racialized burdens, which attempts to bring my theory of racialized organizations into public administration scholarship. So the idea for this paper came about serendipitously as I was thinking about what to work on next. I had published a couple of pieces on race and organizations and was looking for a way to extend my theory beyond sociology. Research on administrative burdens, examine how procedural roadblocks shape policymaking, seemed like one place where unequal racial processes might occur in organizations. And it would help connect my theory to work on race in the state. I had just ordered Pam and Don's book when Pam reached out and said they were also thinking about working with me, thinking about using my theory more explicitly with their work on administrative burdens, and asked if I was interested in collaborating. Of course, I was interested in collaborating, so we got to work. We argue that administrative burdens act as handmaidens of the racialized state, because states often discriminate by applying burdens. Racialized burdens are a type of administrative practice that normalizes and reinforces patterns of racial inequality in public services, simultaneously reproducing disparate treatment and obscuring discrimination. Racialized burdens can be either intentional but plausibly deniable covert rules, or facially neutral rules that disproportionately harm marginalized groups. Administrative burdens can arise or be exacerbated in the context of policy design, as well as through individual discretion in policy implementation. Prior work on race in public administration largely focuses on how the racial composition of bureaucracies influence outcomes for both bureaucrats, such as teachers and police officers, and for the populations they serve. Another stream of research focuses on street-level bureaucrats' use of discretion in ways that advantage whites and penalize non-whites. The concept of racialized burdens complements these works by refocusing on the meso-level of organizational governance that links the macro-level policies and individual micro-level behaviors like discretion. One of the points of administrative burdens is that they remove discretion from individual actors, sometimes including public officials, by imposing onerous rules and compliance procedures. Thus, racialized burdens can pull bureaucrats who are personally supportive of racial equality into the machinery of structural racism if they just faithfully apply onerous rules. Research on administrative burdens also draws attention to how the public experiences interactions with the state. Racialized organizations theory assumes the state relies upon organizations to govern, and that those organizations aren't race neutral. Instead, the state is imbued with racial meanings that are contested, consolidated, and enacted through collective actions. Racialized organizations theory examines habituated patterns of cultural norms and resource distribution that exist beyond the preferences of individual organizational members. In doing so, racialized organizations treat administrative practices, including the application of policy requirements, organizational rules, as mechanisms that help explain persistent patterns of racial inequality. Here, I want to take a moment and pause and consider what we mean by race in the context of racialized burdens. Race is a socially constructed relational category that organizations use as both a rationale and justification for differential treatment. Racialization is the practice of ascribing racial meanings to objects, people, and processes. Importantly, racialization is not a synonym for non-white. That is, all white or white-dominated organizations are also racialized because white is also a race. Rather than simply a demographic characteristic or individual identity, race is a feature of organizational structures. As racial processes influence the likelihood of an organization forming, the organization's daily operations, and the chances of long-term survival. Racialized organizations theory departs from a focus on individual racial identity or demographic composition because it argues that organizations themselves encode racial processes that influence the expression of racial identity. Organizations are racial structures that shape, channel, and in some cases limit how racial identity can be expressed. Seeing racialized relations as a feature of organizations is a key distinction between my work and other work that sees race as something outside of organizations that's ported in, or that sees minority identity or demographic composition as a key driver of racialized organizations. There are two main parts to racialized organizations theory. The first part argues that organizations are racial structures that combine ideas about race with material and social resources. The second part of the theory is a set of tenets explaining how these structures operate in practice. Racialized organizations enhance or diminish the agency of racialized groups. Racialized organizations legitimate the unequal distribution of resources. Whiteness operates as an organizational credential, and the of organizations are often decoupled in practice in a way that's racialized. Racialized burdens are mechanisms of racialized organizations. Excuse me. They are one way, man, giving a talk with a mask on, you know? They are one way ideas about race are connected to resource distribution. Racialized burdens can shape and channel agency by increasing the frictions that we experience when we interact with public services. These burdens include three subcategories: learning costs, like discovering program eligibility, what forms need to be filled out, or how to apply for and stay on public programs; compliance costs that include filling out forms, documenting one's identity and legal standing, waiting in line, or responding to bureaucratic directives; and psychological costs, including stress, frustrations, anxiety, loss of autonomy, or a sense of stigma. What basic theoretical claims become easier to discern by synthesizing racialized organizations and administrative burden frameworks? First, racialized burdens combine access to resources and ideas about race in ways that typically disadvantage racially marginalized groups. For example, many of the administrative burdens prevalent in welfare programs, such as elaborate documentation requirements, are shaped by racist ideas like Reagan's welfare queen, which popularized the myth of rampant fraud in welfare programs with the caricature of a Black woman. These racialized burdens then add labor, or the frustrations that come from dealing with paperwork and disproportionately steal time from racially marginalized groups. The daily interruptions and delays caused by racialized burdens make it harder for people of color to exercise personal agency and reflect the state's ability to impose differential restraints on people's use of time. Individual agency is undermined to the extent that burdens frustrate people's ability to pursue their basic rights. Second, administrative practices can help launder racially disproportionate burdens through facially neutral rules and claims that burdens are necessary for reasons unrelated to race. This may be true even if racism is central to public or policymakers' views about those justifications, such as supposedly preventing fraud and undeserved access to resources. Administrative burdens often hide behind the legitimacy of programs that they are attached to and the public values that those programs seek to achieve. This helps policymakers and organizations appear neutral in principle while reinforcing racial inequality in practice. Third, racialized burdens may emerge as more explicit forms of racial bias in policies or organizational practices become illegal, politically untenable, or culturally unacceptable. Our work is complementary to prior theories outlining the relationship between policy and race, allowing us to connect those theories to public administration in a novel way. First, Joe Sauce and colleagues elaborate the racial classification model, arguing that race becomes important in the policy process when policymakers use racial categories and associated stereotypes to create distinctions in policy outcomes. The racial classification model is a micro-level cognitive one, focused on the likelihood that policymakers use racial cues. Racialized burdens are one way these micro-level cognitive foundations can be institutionalized in meso-level organizational processes. Second, the mechanism of racialized burdens meets the disproportionality and decentralization thresholds that Michener identifies as sufficient conditions for scholarly attention to race. Racialized burdens disproportionately target marginalized groups and are decentralized because implementation is often carried out through state or local functionaries. Even though some aspects of administrative burdens may emerge from discretionary action on the part of the street-level bureaucrat, they're often incorporated into the legitimate rules of an organization or policy, thereby compelling participation. To remain employed, following the rules requires workers put aside their personal aversions to differential treatment. A personally anti-racist bureaucrat who is just following orders may further institutionalize racism despite their feelings. For instance, Celeste Watkin-Hayes argues that individual discretion is channeled by organizations. Her Black respondents said they faced extra scrutiny from white bosses, meaning that intra-racial relations between clients and service providers were more constrained for Black workers, and class boundaries between provider and client were greater for minority group members because they were aware they were being watched. Thus, allegedly neutral bureaucratic rules can be decoupled depending on the racial identity of the person enacting those rules or the person breaking the rule. To be clear, this is not an attempt to absolve individuals of complicity in harmful practices. But the point of institutionalizing administrative burdens is generally to direct and minimize individual discretion. In this respect, racialized burdens become organizational tools that combine the agency-shaping aspects of bureaucratic hierarchies and policy structures with cultural ideas about groups to influence resource distribution. Buried in arcane rules, racialized burdens can provide a colorblind gloss for policymakers that might be sanctioned for openly disenfranchising Black voters or denying welfare recipients their benefits. By complicating seemingly neutral policymaking preferences, politicians and administrators can effectively leverage a tool to maintain white domination. Now that I've outlined the basics of the theory, I'm going to show its applicability in 3 domains: immigration, voting rights, and the social safety net. Racialized burdens feature prominently in US immigration process. Whiteness has literally been a credential, both defining who can be a legal citizen in immigration law and shaping the experience and consequence of burdens. Presidents have used executive branch authority to create burdens that exclude racially marginalized groups, in part by making the process so costly in time and money that they just give up. From 2016 to 2020, the Trump administration dramatically changed the nature of U.S. immigration policy and practice, reducing the ability and thereby agency of both legal and undocumented immigrants attempting to enter the country. It did so without a single piece of legislation, operating entirely through executive branch power. While some changes effectively altered the eligibility of who could enter, others made the process of getting to and staying in America harder via burdens that disproportionately affected racially marginalized immigrants. While the Trump administration actions were labeled at odds with an American ethos of welcoming immigrants, many of the tools employed echoed previous eras of anti-immigrant sentiment. For example, the Trump administration expanded the naturalization test for citizens, adding more questions. The origins of this exam can be found in the 1906 and 1952 Immigration Acts, which added English language and civic requirements during periods of anti-immigrant xenophobia. The Trump administration also resurrected the public charge principle, which limits immigration opportunities for those who might become dependent upon state benefits. The result was to increase compliance costs by forcing individuals to document financial resources. For immigrants seeking to come to America, the State Department used the policy to increase the number of visa denials tenfold, with 94% of denials concentrated in 6 countries with majority non-white populations. In other areas, U.S. immigration policy has moved from explicitly racial designations to colorblind policies that nonetheless target racially marginalized groups with burdens, effectively maintaining whiteness as a credential. Contemporary language surrounding illegal immigrants, characterized as cheaters who need to, quote, get in line and naturalize the right way, is used to legitimate how the immigration process, through burdens, shaped the agency of racially marginalized groups. This language justifies the extension of exceptional burdens around the naturalization process, which requires navigating Byzantine bureaucratic processes. When the Trump administration restricted travel from Muslim-majority countries or limited student visas from Africa or Middle Eastern countries, the formal justification evoked outgroup threat, made by national security rather than racial grounds. But the effect was to exclude non-white groups. The Trump administration also differentially restricted people's agency by stealing time. For example, it reduced staffing and closed overseas consuls, as well as offices that provided help to refugee applicants, even as they demand more documentation from applicants and required in-person interviews for some applicants seeking to enter the US in a form of extreme vetting. Such changes increased learning costs for those who asked to understand the new policies, compliance costs via delays and additional documentation requirements, and psychological costs via stress and frustration. Applicants for refugee status presenting themselves at the border face similar burdens in more dire circumstances. While international law confers a right for a case hearing, the Trump administration adopted processes to effectively void such legal rights. This includes deliberately slowing the process of applications, creating months-long backlogs. The Migrant Protection Program required asylum seekers to stay outside the US while they waited for a hearing, typically in Mexican border towns, often in highly dangerous conditions. New interview standards compelled asylum seekers to provide material documentation of the risks they face, documentation that is in many cases impractical or impossible to get. These grim policies have parallels in US history. In the run-up to and during World War II, nativist members of the State Department used similar tactics to block the migration of Jewish refugees. The purpose of these burdens has been to make the US immigration policy so costly in time and resources that potential migrants lose agency and give up. Racialized burdens have long been used to disempower and limit what is perhaps the most important form of agency in a democracy, the right to vote. Following the 13th, 14th, and 15th constitutional amendments, the architects of Jim Crow were forced to create an illusion of legal race neutrality, even as they designed race-targeted burdens. Ostensibly race-neutral literacy tests and poll taxes disproportionately applied compliance costs to Black Americans, eroding their democratic agency. Recent work has unearthed the centrality of burdens to disenfranchisement efforts, and their long-term consequences. The 1898 Louisiana Constitution was typical in its use of burdens through literacy tests, poll taxes, and property requirements, effectively eliminating Black voter participation. A formerly race-neutral grandfather clause exempted anyone who had voting rights prior to Reconstruction and their sons and grandsons. The clause, of course, only benefited whites. The net effect was long-lasting, with Black voter participation in Louisiana was above whites prior to the Constitution and didn't return to parity for more than 100 years. The past decade has seen a resurgence of burdens in voting. Such burdens reflect a growing partisan belief that limiting the ballot helps the Republican Party and a judicial willingness to allow restrictions, most notably the Supreme Court overturning parts of the Voting Rights Act in 2013 that blocked election practices that would disproportionately hurt voters of color. Since the 2010 election that empowered Republicans, 15 states passed voter ID laws. 12 states have made it harder to register, including mandated requirements to purge voters from the rolls, and 10 made it more difficult to vote early or absentee. Both historically and today, whiteness serves as a credential easing access to the vote. Whiteness in the Jim Crow era largely exempted voters from the burdens that disenfranchised Black Americans. The alleged impartiality of poll taxes was belied by their prohibitive expense for impoverished sharecroppers, or by the requirement forcing Black voters to go before notoriously brutal Southern sheriffs to register. In some cases, Black voters had to bring white witnesses to the register, making whiteness a literal credential for voting. While white and Black voters both took literacy tests, with Black voters' tests held to higher standards of scrutiny or tossed out. Discretion and the decoupling of formal rules and organizational practices plays a critical role in how burdens are racialized. In the Jim Crow era, state legislatures gradually invested more discretion in election officials as tools like poll taxes were declared illegal, under the assumption that street-level bureaucrats would use their discretion in ways that aligned with the politicians' desire to help illiterate white citizens and block Black citizens by humiliating them, working more slowly, demanding excessive documentation, or imposing more difficult literacy tests. For example, a politician in Alabama called for literacy tests to include subjective elements, such as the ability to interpret the Constitution, to give certain discretion to the Board of Registrars and prevent them from registering those elements in our community which have not yet fitted themselves for self-government. While such overt discrimination is, I was going to say unlikely, I would say less likely today, clerks enjoy significant power that can allow them to adjust voter participation consistent with their preferences. For example, one audit study found that local election officials were less likely to provide a response or quality information to Latino names relative to white ones. Minority groups are consistently more likely to be asked for voter IDs, and the differences are more pronounced in states where poll workers have greater discretion. Today, registration and voting frequently require state-issued IDs, which are less widely used by Black voters. Longer lines and wait times decrease turnout, and these burdens disproportionately fall on Black voters. One study found that voter IDs increased wait times in polling places used by Black and Latino voters, but also strikingly reduced wait times for white voters in white-dominated polling places. Black and Latino voters reported waiting 45% and 46% more time, respectively, than white voters in 2018. Racialized burdens are legitimated through fraud claims. Such claims have consequences. Historically, Black people registering to vote face threats from white supremacist groups. Today, voters may still worry about being accosted by poll watchers. In 1981, the Republican Party was barred by a consent decree from organizing poll watchers after they posted armed and uniformed private contractors to polling places in predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, with the premise of fighting fraud. The consent decree was lifted in 2018, even as President Trump falsely insisted voter fraud is widespread and sought to recruit an election security operation. Trump's baseless insistence on widespread voter fraud, claims most frequently directed at jurisdictions with large proportions of Black voters, has undermined faith in basic democratic processes among a large number of his supporters. In some cases, the line between historic strategies to legitimate disenfranchisement and current practice is unbroken. About 11 states feature laws that prevent current and former felons from voting. About 6 million potential voters are disenfranchised as a result. Given how racism has shaped the criminal justice system, such laws disproportionately target Black Americans and meaningfully shape the composition of the electorate. Florida's felon disenfranchisement law was the most egregious, blocking about 1/4 of all the disenfranchised felons in America, and tracing its roots back to post-Reconstruction policies targeted at newly enfranchised Blacks. Popular efforts to restore the franchise to former felons were blocked by new administrative burdens. In 2018, Floridians overwhelmingly voted to eliminate the felon voting ban. Immediately after, Republican legislators required an estimated 800,000 felons to pay off court fines and fees before they could vote. The fees are a compliance cost that can amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The link between payment and voting evokes poll taxes of the past. Former felons also face considerable learning costs. The fines and fees system can involve multiple jurisdictions plus for-profit debt collectors. Strikingly, according to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, the state has no obligation to tell people how much they owe or whether they've met these requirements once they've paid. Potential voters also face the psychological costs of stress and uncertainty. If they vote based on a mistaken belief that they've paid their debts and satisfied the state's requirements, it's a felony that could put them back in prison. Such burdens were successful at maintaining the status quo. 2 years after the referendum striking down the law, just 8% of eligible former felons had registered to vote for the 2020 election. The social welfare system in the United States has been embedded with racialized burdens throughout its history. Both the design and actual distribution of these benefits, which comprise 40% of the federal budget, inhibit the agency of Black Americans, stealing their time while simultaneously legitimizing the racialized distribution of benefits. Blacks and Latinos are more than 3 times as likely to say they experienced discrimination when applying for welfare services or public assistance because of their race. These burdens are enhanced in the context of high levels of bureaucratic discretion, or their decoupling of formal rules from organizational practice, which allows for their racialized administration. In this segregated and decoupled system of benefits, whiteness again operates as a credential, more often shielding white Americans from the consequences of these burdens. Racialized burdens were present at the origin of the first major US welfare system, pensions for Civil War veterans. Here, colorblind laws failed to account for Black veterans' differing historical relationship to citizenship, with the result of both undermining their agency and legitimizing unequal benefit distribution. The many limits on Black agency under slavery created a path dependency that carried over into bureaucratic procedures following abolition. Black veterans were less likely to be literate, less likely to have the financial resources necessary to engage with bureaucrats and navigate arbitrary bureaucratic hurdles. Also, because many dropped their enslaver's name following emancipation, newly freed slaves often lacked the paperwork necessary to satisfy documentation requirements. As a result, a much smaller fraction of Black veterans accessed these pensions relative to their white peers. Black veterans of World War II faced similar challenges. Racialized burdens also reduced their agency while legitimating a decentralized process of benefit distribution stacked against them. The GI Bill was a federal program and ostensibly colorblind in the promise of benefits. Southern senators, whose votes were necessary for the passage of the bill, feared that such benefits would undermine the Jim Crow racial order. And so the program was designed to filter federal resources through local VA offices. Here, local public officials and private actors, such as loan officers and banks, devised burdens to exclude Black veterans. The result was to constrain Black access to a wealth-generating mechanism that proved central to the mid-20th century growth of the white middle class. Contemporary racialized administrative burdens and social welfare programs are rooted in the historical design of these programs, the design that provides a legitimate cover. Racially marginalized groups are more likely to be served in means-tested social welfare programs that impose higher levels of administrative burdens on beneficiaries, including temporary aid for needy families and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. By contrast, white beneficiaries are disproportionately served in social insurance, like Social Security and tax subsidy welfare programs, where administrative burdens are borne by government or private bureaucracies instead of the beneficiaries. The shifting of administrative burdens from state organizations to beneficiaries for means-tested programs has significant consequences in terms of stealing time from racially marginalized groups and their access to benefits. Means-tested benefits like SNAP or Medicaid require lengthy eligibility forms, substantial documentation of employment and earnings, interviews, and recertification as frequently as every 6 to 12 months. By comparison, one need only fill out a short form to receive Social Security. The government and employers keep track of marital status and lifetime earnings to define eligibility and benefit size. The differences in the racial composition of these two categories of social welfare programs, and thus the racial distribution of administrative burdens, are large. Black people are twice as likely to rely on Medicaid coverage and 2/3 as likely to have employer-based health insurance. Black women, as compared to their fraction of the population, are more likely to draw on means-tested benefits, such as SNAP and TANF, whereas white women benefit more from spousal and survivor Social Security benefits. This is not to say, of course, that white beneficiaries are immune from administrative burdens and welfare programs. The collateral damage that these policies inflict on low-income whites legitimates claims of race neutrality and the denial of intent, even if the policies disproportionately affect racially marginalized groups. Such an approach may reflect a, quote, divide and conquer political strategy, helping to undermine policies portrayed as benefiting, for example, Black Americans. Such legitimations also help to explain the paradox that while more whites receive welfare, the visual images that people see and associate with welfare are negatively framed images of people of color. Indeed, there's a robust evidence that the attacks on the federal welfare programs, some of which have been around since the 1930s, parallel with Black beneficiaries gaining access to these programs via the 1960s Civil Rights Movement and the 1964 and 65 Civil Rights Act. Further, the number of Black beneficiaries on state caseloads correlates with more punitive welfare rules, such as harsher sanctioning, specifically losing benefits when beneficiaries make procedural mistakes, such as missing an appointment with a welfare officer. Bureaucratic discretion can further entrench racial inequalities, in part by enhancing whiteness as a credential. Discretion is applied unevenly to Black and white claimants in traditional welfare programs like TANF. Welfare caseworkers, for example, are more likely to penalize Black participants for failing to navigate burdens, while white beneficiaries may be given the benefit of the doubt. So I've argued that understanding relationships between public organizations and race requires a historical perspective on the roots of racialized burdens. The offspring of burdens employed in the Civil War pension system, social welfare programs, voting procedures, and immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century can be found in contemporary policies and programs. The historical recurrence of racialized burdens and justifications that disempower racially marginalized groups is a compelling argument for their durability and intentionality. Attention to history reveals not just the durability and mutations of racialized burdens, but an understanding of why they emerge and adapt. Across our examples, racialized burdens can be most easily observed when forms of overt racism are no longer viable, deemed illegal or politically unacceptable, but racial intent remains. In immigration, xenophobic statements of political sponsors may occur alongside the imposition of burdens that claim race neutrality. In voting, Jim Crow era burdens emerge after the Reconstruction Amendments and evolved as tools such as literacy tests are gradually deemed illegal. Relaxing legal constraints, such as the Supreme Court decision removing the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, gave life to a new wave of burdens. The close connection between racially coded dog whistles around welfare with racially impactful burdens shows how burdens bridge illegal racial discrimination and legal racially disparate outcomes. Close attention to justifications is important because political actors might rarely provide frank displays of intentionality regarding race. Certainly, we see examples of explicit racial invocations in the past, and we can find examples today, such as Trump's justifications for extreme vetting of immigrants. A second and more frequent type of justification, more apt to appear in the administrative domain, instead uses the language of seemingly neutral administrative values, such as efficiency, innovation, or modernization. Administrative justifications also rely on claims about fraud, illegality, or lack of deservingness. The latter type of rationalization reflect a third type of justification from the political domain, one which is not explicitly racial, but relies on coded language that plays upon broad stereotypes. Public campaigns against welfare, voting rights, and immigration all rely upon racialized tropes of deservingness to justify administrative burdens. Racially marginalized groups are presented as threats. People intent on taking something, a welfare benefit, citizenship, a house in a historically white neighborhood, the right to vote, that they haven't earned, don't deserve, or aren't capable of managing. Regardless of the setting and dynamics, a disciplined search for racialized burdens allows us to uncover and compare aspects of the administrative state usually kept hidden. The concept of racialized burdens also shows how structural racism becomes institutionalized by state organizations distributing resources. Because racialized burdens are often facially neutral, studying them can show how racial inequality is reproduced while concealing or providing an alibi for the why. And I'll leave it at that.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and we're also monitoring the chat online.
Stay here. No questions. Cool.
Hi. First of all, thanks for the presentation. I really appreciate it, especially as you just got done teaching critical race theory in like one of my classes. So great. I was wondering, I wonder how much suggestion or commentary or how much it falls within the realm of your research, incorporating neoliberal ideology into all of this, right? Because it seems that the onus is of proving deservingness, right? The idea of earning it and the idea of doing all the efforts stems, or at least is supported by this neoliberal idea of individual effort, defunding of public institutions, right? The idea that you have to earn it and work for yourself, as opposed to creating a more, sustainable system. Has that factored into your research analysis?
So no, the short answer is no, it has not factored in. But to respond to the question, maybe I'm going to ask a question is, I think you're right that neoliberal ideology is like one kind of justification that people use for this. But if that was the case, then you shouldn't see the racialized impacts, right? Because the sort of ideology there is this applies to everyone equally.
Oh, sure.
And so yeah, I think that like that kind of ideology can work as a sort of support for these policies and programs. But I would also argue that, some people would argue that neoliberalism is a kind of racial project that is about like who's deserving and who should face more risks. So yeah, I think it's consistent, but I haven't talked about that, or we haven't talked about that.
All right. Okay. But yeah, no, thanks for that.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to think of, so also thank you for your thought, your talk here. I'm trying to think of ways to approach this in a sort of a wondering if there's ways to diagnose the racialization amount that an organization or an agency has that does not require you to have the research burden of needing to actually gain access to all of the policies and do this really deep dive on what they're doing. For example, do you have to understand what the impact is of a burden put on, or is it simply enough to count how many burdens are being put in place And then you could safely assume that those burdens are having a disproportionate impact. I'm trying to just think of like a faster way to assess this organization looks like it has a bigger problem than this organization.
A faster, so I'm a big fan of audit studies for this kind of thing. And so I would say, you know, we cite that audit study in which like people, they just created fake names and they had people call their representative to get information about voting, and the representatives were less likely to call back people with quote unquote Hispanic sounding names, right? So I think that kind of thing is really useful, and no research is really that quick, but faster. I think another kind of thing that I thought was really innovative is one of the studies I cited about folks waiting for in line to vote, and that hugely disproportionate. They use cell phone data. So they had like objective measures of how long people were in line because they had like literally the location data of the cell phones, right? And so I do think there's things like that you could do. So yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm having a hard time not thinking about our own institution right now, because we're going through a process to reimagine the College of Arts and Sciences. And we're also going through a process of a compensation study, right, to deal with inequities in compensation. That keeps getting done over and over and over again, right? So your concept of stealing time in order to solve problems that don't exist, or to steal time to not solve the problems that have already been identified. And I'm, you know, and so I'm trying, the language that you're using is I'm working on trying to connect it to the language I hear out of our upper administration that is seemingly race neutral, that is also seemingly to, some of it is intended to address racial disparity, but it's using language of equality and not equity in some cases. And it's and so I'm looking for language for questions to ask that uncovers this, right? So you've got administrators that are, like you said, they're like the street level bureaucrats is similar of being, you know, progressive and sort of supportive, but the structures that they're responding to provide privatization of the university, or the, you know, all of that, you know, the performance-based budgeting and all of that kind of. I'm watching an impact that's going to have a bit, you know,
So I think there's a number of things I think of here. One is, I'm not sure how the study is conducted, but like oftentimes when things like this happen, I'm like, they have the data, so why are they asking me to like fill out a survey, right? Like they have all the data. This is taking my time. The other thing, and this is sort of like a bit afield from your question in terms of stealing time, is that I think about this. I mean, yeah, you can go with what we kind of know and use the levers that already exist to alleviate some of these kinds of disparities, right? So for instance, I'll use two very quick examples. One is like student evaluations, which we know have like horrible racial and gender biases and then get used in tenure and promotion cases anyway. You can stop using them, right? You can figure out ways to get rid of those things. The other thing is, and I've talked to I've talked to administrators about this. I've said this when they're like, what do we do? I'm like, universities vary in their resources. I understand that, but sometimes there's like this pot of money for like, hey, if you do this, I'll give you $500 and you can go to a conference, right? That's discretionary from certain administrators. And so we know, if you look at sort of like the data on mentoring, that the burden falls on women and it falls disproportionately on women of color. If you know that there's a department that is vastly disproportionate, hey, right? Like find some sort of, like, you might not be able to give them a raise, but you can like give them research funds. You can pay for a conference. You can figure out, you can use the levers that you use. I mean, those levers are like for merit, and they're often like a symbolic, we value this labor, right? We value what you're doing. And so if you value diversity, if you value those things, use those symbolic levers in the way that you're already using them to show the things that you really value. Because when I see you giving money to a certain thing, I know that's actually what you value. I don't know if that gets to the question, but I think the stealing time point is useful. And I think ultimately that's one of the things that like pay disparities do, right? Is they steal, it's theft of time, because you have to work greater hours in order to have the same amount.
Right, so we have a question in the chat on Zoom.
Hi.
All right. Okay, it's a bit of a long one, so.
Okay,
Okay.
let me write it down.
In parents involved in community schools versus Seattle School District Number 1, Clarence Thomas essentially stated that as long as a policy is not explicitly written in a racially discriminatory manner, any racially disparate outcomes that result from that policy are constitutional. Given the ability to hide the production of racially disparate outcomes and administrative burdens that are not explicitly written as racially discriminatory, does this Supreme Court precedent suggest that such practices by bad actors will likely be easily legally defensible going forward?
I mean, I would say the short answer is yes. Right, so I think, parents involved is that case. I think they might correct me if I'm wrong, in which the Chief Justice said the way to stop discrimination against race is to stop discriminating by race, like this tautological sort of colorblind ideology. So yeah, I think. So let me go back to the area that I'm more comfortable, because I wrote about it in the paper. And if we look at sort of the Supreme Court ruling on the quote unquote Muslim ban, in which Trump had like tweets that were saying, I'm going to do a Muslim ban, right? Like they were explicitly racialized and targeting a minority group. And the Supreme Court was like, well, we know he tweeted and we know that's what he said, but the law is actually colorblind. And so that's what we're going to go with. And this is a national security concern. This is not about sort of targeting Muslims. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that the Supreme Court leans in that direction. It's depressing, no?
There was the one case in Texas, the housing, for the fair housing case in 2015, 16, that allowed disparate impact rules for housing discrimination.
Okay.
But it kind of, that was right before Trump came into office, and it's gone quiet now.
It's gone quiet,
So
yeah.
how that is, and it was at the state level, it's, what level of, it was a Texas case. It was.
And it allowed a disparate impact?
It
Because
allowed you to use disparate impact for housing discrimination case.
because that has been getting chipped away at too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I'm so excited.
I actually have my own question too. So this is a little bit related to what Roberto was saying earlier, but the example of the safety net and sort of the costs and time, and also the linkages with faculty and mentoring, it kind of struck me kind of the intersectionality of race, gender, and with respect to safety net, of course, class also, right? And I think a comparison might be, for example, looking at TANF versus the earned income tax credit, right? TANF has basically been decimated, right?
Yeah.
Very
It's
few
like,
people get it.
yeah.
Whereas the ITC, from what I've read, is the most effective poverty policy outside of Social Security now. And I think it would be interesting to look at sort of the racialized burdens of the ITC, because I imagine there are some. I think though that one of the differences is the ITC is protected in a way because it's people who are working. right? You have to work a certain number of hours to get the EITC. And so it's actually administratively much easier, right? You file your income taxes and you get, instead of paying, you get the refund, right? So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about like kind of intersectionality with respect to some of these racialized burdens.
So I think, I'm not sure what you mean in terms of intersectionality in terms of the racialized burdens. Like I would think like welfare specifically has been targeting or you know, sort of the image of the undeserving welfare recipient has for a very long time in the public mind been a Black woman, and like that stigmatization has been very, very effective. I would also say this is not, well, I won't use the language, but also, you know, immigration policy and the sort of rhetoric around immigration that was happening for a while about women coming to the US to have children, whose children would get citizenship, was also, you know, deeply sort of kind of gendered racism that, that was part of it. So I think yes, these are definitely sort of intersectional policies. I think you would need to, as you're pointing to, you would need to look at the specific policy to see the kinds of impacts, right? So I would say voting rights could be the case, but I would say that, you know, probably there's more men disenfranchised from sort of like felon disenfranchisement or those kinds of things than women, just given the sort of numbers. And, you know, if we think about things like Civil War pensions, also that was not all, but mostly men. And so I think it depends on the policy, but it is a point, it's a point taken. Right?
Questions?
Okay.
About social movements and pushing back against the problems and the the effects of racialized burdens. So I don't know if you wanted to speak more broadly or focus on one of the three areas in terms of immigration, voting, or the safety net. But where do you see movement organizations or activists and organizers possibly, where should they maybe focus their efforts or target their their work to minimize the—
Oh wow, this is the question I like had such a hard time with this weekend too.
Yeah, and I was asking this.
Wow.
I was just a part of the Sociology Education Association online conference where Dr. Ray was our keynote speaker, and there's questions about
on the ground organizing around anti-critical race theory stuff, and I was like, I don't know. I mean, it's sort of. I think so. I might have a better answer than I did there. I think there's on the ground organizing to, especially if we take like immigration, right, and folks who are asylum seekers or stranded because of the Remain in Mexico policy. There's literally like folks saving lives, trying to do, sort of like basic harm reduction, material interventions to keep people alive. There's also a bigger movement of folks like lawyers fighting cases, and I don't have those skills. But I think that is one way to do it. I think the other thing is, the Trump administration really, they really tried to destroy the bureaucracy from the inside with lots of the policies. And so like, this sounds like even weird for me to say it, but just like committed, relatively like, not apolitical, but like civil servants who are going to fulfill their job as a civil servant, regardless of whether they're registering a Republican or a Democrat, or whether they are serving a from a movement perspective, right? I know individual discretion, I'm criticizing that to some degree, but, folks who like stood up to that destruction internally were really important. And I think, I criticize being sort of like co-opted into the machinery in this paper, but like, here's some examples of folks who are saying like, I have to do my job and I'm going to be a whistleblower, or I'm going to try and slow down their destruction from the inside because what they're doing is not great and it's harming people. So those are the kinds of things I think around immigration. I mean, there's tons of sort of folks working on the voting rights piece. I think the Brennan Center is like incredible. If you all know that this center at NYU, the Brennan Center for Justice, that's tracking all of the sort of anti-voting rights laws. I swear I check their website like once a week. And they, they're tracking all the laws. They're tracking sort of the takeovers of the machinery of voting. Yeah, so I think there's a lot, right? I think with this, I think there's a lot more that can be done than I thought in sort of the on the ground critical race stuff.
If I may add, at least from the immigration perspective.
Yeah.
One of the racialized burdens of immigration is the reliving and dealing with trauma, right? So when people are coming to the southern border and they're seeking asylum, they have to go, once they're in the detention center, they have to go through what's called a credible fear interview. Yeah, so it's forcing, it's as part of the asylum process, it's forcing people to dump their trauma and to have it be considered legitimate enough, right? To be able to go to the place of destination. So I think coming back to what Melanie was saying, like maybe a social movement approach is through combating that need for people to relive horribly traumatic events, and reducing or mitigating or hopefully eliminating the need for bureaucracies to incorporate that psychologically damaging part.
I think that makes sense. I think, there's some legal reason they do that, right? In order to grant asylum. But I want to make a bigger point in response to your question, is that like these things could be otherwise. And if we look at sort of Ukraine right now and the number of countries that said we're just going to take refugees, we could just take refugees, right? If you look at sort of Biden's programs, I have a 9-year-old and all of a sudden I filled out no paperwork. I did nothing. All of a sudden I just like started getting these checks. I don't even know what the policy was for. I don't even understand why I got these checks because I never looked it up, but I cashed the checks, right? So they had a sort of like, does anyone know what those were for? But they had this sort of,
Your tax refunds won't be the same, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I know, but my only point of saying that is like, these burdens are a choice. They're an intentional way to disincentivize people from getting things that they are often legally entitled to get. Sometimes, like asylum, guaranteed by international law, right? Or like protected by international law, at least the hearing. And so I think it's important to remember that like these rationalizations are flimsy. Like the rationalizations aren't actually the real reasons, because you can see how quickly those rationalizations go out the door when it's a policy that the folks in charge support.
We just, in Dr. Gaff's social stratification and inequality class last week, we discussed your racialized organizations article and had a big discussion around how could we reduce the racialized burdens. And basically what we came up with is reverse the system so that you're qualified unless proven unqualified.
Yeah, opt in instead of opt out.
Yeah, so that it was like all the administrative time was kind of trying to weed unqualified people out instead of so that. But and then second, moving on from that, when you just said, all these people are opting to take Ukrainian refugees, it's making me think about this huge populist response to Syrian refugees. So
I want to be like, they should, right? I think that's good.
But what it made me think of is like there was a huge racialized response to
Syrian refugees.
Yeah.
That, changed so much of how the UK is governed, it's,
And- And now many of those
Right.
countries that had that
France
response
and-
are saying we're opening our doors.
right, it's so such a
Yeah.
completely different when it's a white refugee, European than when it was
Yeah.
a differently
Yeah.
racialized.
Yeah, these things could be different. Like that's the thing is like these are choices. And oftentimes the rationalizations are not, they're paper thin rationalizations.
We looked at the documentation for rental assistance.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's another one.
I was watching the news, even the Ukraine refugees, the colored refugees, they have a hard time.
Oh,
So,
really?
yeah, it's all the white ones. Still have any trouble, but
Yeah.
it's a different.
There is.
Yeah.
Even among even that are kind of in the same situation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm. Because there was this black man who was saying that they'll have this hard time to get on the bus. Because you remember those opponents who just taking on the bus, and they they'll have something to get on the bus.
Okay.
Sorry, so just unless others have questions. Just to make sure before you end, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your new book coming out.
Yeah.
Critical race theory.
So, yeah.
Since we in Kentucky are in a state where we have legislation that is trying to ban talk about,
Yeah,
different
so
forms of racism.
I turned it in today, actually,
Oh,
the revision. It still needs a lot of work, in my opinion, like, don't write a book this fast. So, yeah, I have a book coming out called On Critical Race Theory that is, I think it's not really, so it's a response to what's happening in one way, in that I think people need to know sort of, this is what social construction means. Here's Derek Bell's interest convergence. These are basic ideas that are being misrepresented or not even present in the sort of public moral panic about critical race theory. So it's a response in that way. It is not a response in the sense that like, I don't engage with nonsense arguments, right? I'm like, these folks are sort of bad actors who are misrepresenting or lying about what critical race theory is and its history. I am not going to give them a lot of sort of screen time in the book. I set them up in the beginning, and then I'm like, here's social construction, here's whiteness as property, here's, key ideas that I think are useful. So it's available for pre-order. It's supposed to be. Yeah.
Great, and is it 2022 or 2023, do you know yet?
Supposedly August.
Oh, great, okay, August of this year.
Yeah. Well, they were like, the press pressured me to work very, very quickly. So I did. And it makes so I'm used to writing for the public. That is quick, but doing it on a book level is like a whole new thing that I've never done before. Like it's my first book. So.
Keep our eyes out for it.
Thank
All
you.
right, please join me in thanking Dr. Ray for spread of desserts and sweets together by Nancy Price. Thank you, Nancy. So please stop on your way out. Get some treats.
And they were probably like your friends.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, that question. Will I keep love this one?
No.